Welcome to Module 2 of the Building Literacy in Social Studies webinar series. This module introduces participants to the instructional shifts that are required by the Iowa Core Literacy Standards for History and Social Studies. If you are not able to join webinar number 1 around an overview of the standards, please see webinar number 1 for information about how to access these standards, or go to www.iowacore.gov and click on Literacy to access the literacy standards specific to History and Social Studies 612. As a result of this session, participants will be able to define instructional shifts of the Iowa Core specific to literacy standards for History and Social Studies. They will also be able to think about connecting their own teaching practices to these instructional shifts. So first, what we want you to think about is when you hear the term instructional shift, what is the first thing that comes to mind? If you are doing this on your own, you can jot this down on paper or just simply think and reflect about this term. If you're doing this with a small or large group, you may want to do think, pair, share, or writing down a definition and sharing it with your partner and then with a larger group. The important thing to remember about the term instructional shift is that it does not mean that we are saying that all instruction currently needs to shift dramatically in connection with new literacy standards. What it is saying is that we need to think about small changes in instruction that need to happen and think about what also needs to continue happening that we're doing right now in order to improve student learning. The first thing that we're going to do is watch an overview video around the 6 shifts in the Iowa Core Literacy Standards. Within the handouts that are attached to this webinar, you also have an informational sheet around the 6 shifts and a definition of each shift. So let's take a look at this overview video.
Begin to make the transition from the 2005 state standards to the Common Core.
I think what's most useful in looking at the Common Core in literacy is to focus on 6 primary shifts in instruction. The kind of changes, the fundamental changes of the heartbeat of the core, so that students really are college and career ready by the time we're done with K through 12. And you might first ask, why do we need to shift? And the commissioner has already talked about the kind of graduation rate and the problem of remediation. But you can see it even earlier. If you look at 8th grade NAEP scores, the 8th grade National Assessment of Educational Progress, for 40 years, 8th grade reading scores have not improved at all. They've been completely flat during a period in which we've doubled educational spending. So we've made some progress in reading in the earliest grades, but we've really hit a wall in later reading instruction and later comprehension, not just in New York State, but really throughout the country. And so I like to think of the standards as a battering ram to break through that wall. And in order to do that, 6 things need to change. So the first change in instruction in the core standards is in kindergarten to 5th grade, there's an equal balance of informational text and literary text. What I mean by that is overwhelmingly today in kindergarten to 5th grade, students read stories, they read literature. And we have data that only 7% of what students read now in kindergarten to 5th grade is informational text, including text about history or science, information about the world. And what that does, and that's also true of the curriculum they read and the exams they take. But research is clear that the general knowledge built in those early years about the world not only allows them to do history and science in later grades, but actually allows students to read more complex text because they gain a vocabulary and knowledge of the world that informs everything they read. And so it's particularly important for students from diverse backgrounds that they gain a shared general knowledge and rich vocabulary, which they can only gain by reading a coherent succession of knowledge, gaining a coherent succession of knowledge by reading informational text in kindergarten through 5th grade. I think, by the way, this is a wonderful opportunity for elementary school teachers, because what happened was we made K-5 literacy instruction mostly literature, and then we expanded the literacy block because reading and math are so important. We effectively got rid of science and history. We kind of put them off to the side. The core standards enable elementary school teachers to reclaim their rightful role as teaching students about the world through history and science and the arts, as well as literary text. Shift number 2 continues that same theme, but in grades 6 through 12. So rather than these being English language arts standards, they're English language arts standards and also standards for literacy in history and social studies, as well as science and technical subjects. That is, the standard your state has adopted require that science and history teachers take a strong role in educating their children to gain knowledge through reading and writing. Students' ability to read complex primary and secondary sources in history is essential to their independent work in history and social sciences. And of course, in science, one's ability to draw knowledge from text is essential to the practice of every scientist. Practicing scientists spend at least half their time reading, in addition to the direct experiments they do. So that's a shift in instruction. So rather than putting the burden entirely on the English teachers, we're really sharing the burden of literacy instruction throughout the disciplines. The third shift is the advancement of reading in these core standards is an advancement in the complexity of the text that students are reading. Typically, state standards have focused on the skills students gain as they grow in their grades, but that's an okay measure, really just okay, of their reading growth. The real difference between a college and career-ready reader is the level of text complexity, the level of text difficulty they can master. And what we found in researching the standards is that the level of text difficulty, the level of complexity, is far beneath in our high schools what is required for the first year of college. So it's no mystery why there are these high remediation rates, because the diet of students is not at the level that they then face when they enter college or technical courses or career environments. So for the first time, the standards, the core standards, create a staircase of text complexity. What I mean by that is, if you're ready to read third grade text based on these standards, you're then ready for fourth and fifth grade text. Then you're ready to go to sixth to eighth grade text. Then to high school level text, which for these standards truly prepares you for the rigors of college and career. The fourth shift is a focus on text-based answers. What we found reviewing curricula and reviewing instruction informally was an overwhelming number of questions that students are asked when they're reading text, perhaps surprisingly, don't require that you carefully read the text itself. So perhaps in the desire to engage students, we ask them all sorts of questions about what they feel, what they think about, what text might remind them of or connect to. And it's not that those questions aren't valuable, but when they take up 80% of the time, what gets lost is the careful analysis of the text itself and drawing evidence from the text. And it's really that core activity that these standards focus on. How much knowledge and evidence does a student gain from each text that they read, and can they integrate that rich knowledge together? Once that's done, of course, it's very exciting to connect that close work to their experience, to their other reading, but we need first an immersion in the evidence and facts of the text. The fifth shift is what we're calling here writing to sources. If we were to talk about the most popular forms of writing today in the American high school, and since I am a New Yorker myself, I know that they're equally popular in our state, it would be narrative writing. Narrative writing of both personal opinion, meaning what you think about heroes or garbage disposal or school uniforms, for example. These are the common parlance of narrative opinion writing. Things about what you think about things, but also your own experience. So what you've experienced at times, life, intense experiences. So narratives about your opinion or your experience are at the core of high school writing today. The only problem is, the more you enter the world of career and college, people frankly care a lot less about what you feel or what you think. What they do care about very much, though, is whether you can argue based on evidence. Can you assemble evidence that is verifiable and make a claim and support it? Can you convey complex information clearly? So what happens in these core standards is, while narrative is carefully cultivated, more so in the earliest grades, when it's an essential way to develop students' voice and expressiveness and creativity, and also, by the way, an essential way that they gain command of sequence that's essential for argument and informational writing. But in high school, the dominant forms of writing more clearly become writing to argue and writing to inform, in order so students are ready. And what's also exciting, for the first time, we begin building those capacities from the earliest grades. So beginning in kindergarten, you may know that young children love to argue, and we cultivate their ability to write about that from the youngest stages. The final shift is academic vocabulary is at the core of these standards, and you might even say the true language of power that these standards celebrates. That is, if you look at traditional English language arts standards or a traditional textbook, the first few pages of it are the overwhelming list of literary terminology that they've focused on, such as metonymy, etc., raising plot, rising plot, falling plot, etc. We all know those terms. And they have a role in the hands of a gifted teacher. But the crucial vocabulary that students really need to master is the academic vocabulary that is prevalent not just in complex literary texts, but all complex texts, science texts, history texts. What I mean here is not as much domain-specific vocabulary like amoeba or cell wall, which is often helpfully bolded on the right side of the page when you're reading, but academic vocabulary like subsequent or hypothesis or theory or evidence. And if you don't grasp those words, all of complex text is not available to you. And this is particularly important for our ELL students because intensive focus on this academic vocabulary allows those students into a full range of texts that would otherwise not be open to them. So those 6 shifts, you might sum them up as reading like a detective and writing like an investigative reporter. The college and career-ready student can read a range of sufficiently complex text, understand it, analyze it, make thoughtful connections between it, integrate knowledge from it, and then write about it quickly. And that's the heart of the student.
Okay, so that was an overview around the 6 instructional shifts from David Coleman. We are going to go back to our webinar. As you think about what David Coleman said in giving that overview of the 6 instructional shifts, think about either on your own or with your group, what really rang true for you from the video. So you may want to pause the webinar right now before we start our next activity. Okay, the next activity we're going to do is taking those instructional shifts and putting them into your own words, making them really real for what makes sense to you, and especially thinking about within your social studies classroom, how do each of those shifts apply? So in the handouts attached to this webinar, there is a chart that identifies each of the shifts. And so you're going to put those shifts in your own words, kind of come up with your own definition for each of those shifts. If you're with a group, you're going to share that definition with your group or do it together as a group. Then you're going to think about, in that next column, what does each of those shifts look like in that classroom? So if I were to come into a classroom and ask a student, how is academic vocabulary sort of put into practice, what would that look like in the classroom, or what would that student say? Then you're going to think as a group or individually about how each shift connects to social studies. And so, for example, within academic vocabulary, such a critical shift in social studies because so many Tier 1 and Tier 2 words are social studies words, and frequently those are words that are difficult for students to access. So how would that shift look like within your social studies classroom? So either individually or as a group, work on completing that chart for this particular activity. As we close out this short webinar in thinking about the 6 instructional shifts, we want you to reflect, and these questions are also within your handouts. So thinking about how are these shifts relevant to your own teaching, and what do you need to know more about in order to incorporate these shifts into your own instructional practices. The webinars that follow this particular webinar are taking each shift and breaking it down, giving lots more detail about the specific strategies that go along with each shift. So please look at those webinars for information about how to think about each shift within your own social studies classroom. As always, if you have any questions about this particular webinar or the webinar series, please contact Stephanie Wager at iowa.gov. Thank you so much.